While I was away at a conference, my boss erased my entire team without a word. When I came back and saw their desks gone, I just stayed quiet. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. My boss had no idea what that silence meant. I left the office for 3 days. When I came back, my entire team was gone. I had just returned from an industry conference in San Francisco. 3 days of talking about products, trends, and the things people always call the future. The trip itself was not much different from the others, except for that familiar heaviness you get after hearing the same promises repeated for years. That morning in Seattle, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The sky was still gray, the air damp and cold. Everything in the lobby looked the same. The receptionist nodded at me out of habit. No one seemed awkward. No one rushed to avoid my eyes. There were no warning signs. The elevator carried me up to the 12th floor. I stood alone, watching the numbers light up in silence. I had worked on that floor for nearly 20 years, long enough to recognize every small sound of a Monday morning. The doors opened. I stepped out, and in that instant, I knew something was wrong. It was not quiet. Tech offices can be quiet in the early hours. It was the fact that no one looked up when I walked in. After 18 years, I was used to the small nods, the brief greetings. Not friendly, not formal, just the acknowledgement of people who understood the weight of shared responsibility. That morning, there was nothing. I walked a few steps farther and reached the area where my product reliability team used to sit. I stopped. Not because I was stunned, but because I needed to be sure I was looking at the right place. There were no desks, no monitors, no network cables, no rolling chairs, just bare partitions clean in a way that felt cold. As if no one had ever worked there. As if there had never been long nights watching releases go live or emergency calls in the middle of the night. I stood there for a few seconds, my bag still in my hand. My mind did not panic. What I felt instead was familiar. The sensation you get in operations when you realize a system has been changed without notice. I pulled out my phone and checked my email. Nothing. No urgent meeting, no message, not even a cursory explanation. My inbox was empty except for automated emails I had not opened during the trip. Someone had done this very quickly and very neatly. I started noticing the details. Power outlets disconnected. Network cables are carefully coiled. There were no signs of anger or haste. This was not impulsive. This had been planned. A colleague from another department walked by. When he saw me standing there, he slowed down slightly. His eyes flicked toward the space behind me, then back to my face. His voice dropped. They restructured. Just 4 words. No elaboration. None was needed. I nodded in thanks. He walked off faster, as if lingering any longer might be unsafe. I looked back at the empty area in front of me. What struck me was that I did not feel angry. Not yet. What surfaced instead was a familiar irony. We talk endlessly about data, system history, and institutional memory. Yet, when it comes to people, we can erase everything over a single weekend. I walked toward the small kitchen at the end of the hall. On the shelf was a blue ceramic mug chipped slightly at the rim. Linda's mug. She used it every morning. No one had taken it. I picked it up, then set it back down. Not because I did not care, but because I understood what it meant. This decision had been made so fast that no one thought about details like that. I returned to my own desk. Everything was still there. My computer, my notebook, a stack of unfinished documents. That told me a lot. I had not been removed. I had been left behind alone with the expectation that I would understand. I sat down and turned on my computer. Still no emails, no meeting invites. No, we need to talk. Just a silence that was deliberate, not accidental. If you are listening to this story, I want to pause for a moment. Not to explain, but to ask you something. Where are you listening from? A big city, a small town, or somewhere you once felt yourself replaced by a new idea that sounded very modern and very convincing? I do not believe stories like this belong to one country. They happen anywhere people believe that moving fast matters more than understanding what they are changing. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow breath. A simple question formed in my mind, one that was not comfortable at all. Can a company erase an entire team over a single weekend? Not because they failed, not because they made mistakes, but because someone believed there was a newer, faster, shinier way to do things. I had worked here for 18 years. I had seen restructurings before. Strategies come and go. I knew the difference between change and removal. Change takes time. Change comes with explanations. Change requires accountability. What I was standing in front of had none of those signs. I looked again at the space where my team used to sit, and in that moment, I understood one thing with complete clarity. This was not a change. This was the beginning of a mistake. They did not remove my team because they hated me. They did it because they believed they had found something better. The company-wide meeting invite arrived late that morning. There was no dramatic subject line, just a short note saying leadership would be sharing a new product direction. I read the email once, then closed it. The neutral wording made it feel like every other strategy meeting before it, as if nothing unusual had happened that morning on the 12th floor. The large conference room was nearly full when I walked in. I chose a seat in the middle row, close enough to see the screen, but not close enough to draw attention. The conversations around me were ordinary. A few questions about the conference trip, a mild complaint about an early flight. No one mentioned my team, not because they did not know, but because in environments like this, people learn very quickly when silence is safer. Richard Vaughn stepped to the front as the room settled. He looked the same as always, polished, confident, comfortable in front of an audience. I had worked with Richard long enough to know he was not incompetent. He understood pressure from the board, from the market, from the numbers someone always wanted to see climbing quarter after quarter. He opened with the familiar big picture. The market was moving fast. Competitors were ahead. The company needed to accelerate or risk falling behind. None of that was wrong. I had never argued with those points. No one in that room could, honestly. Then he moved to the core message. Richard said it was time to redefine how the company built products. Not just to improve, but to change at the foundation. On the screen behind him, keywords appeared one by one. Artificial intelligence, growth, speed, market share, radical innovation. I heard a few approving murmurs. It was the language every technology boardroom recognized. Then Richard introduced Caleb Sterling. Caleb stood up from the front row and walked onto the stage, younger than I expected, dressed simply, the kind of look people in tech like to call substance over style. When he began speaking, I understood immediately why Richard believed he was the answer to so many current pressures. Caleb spoke smoothly and with confidence, not rushed, not pretending to know everything. He talked about data, predictive models, and how artificial intelligence could shorten release cycles and optimize resources. The examples sounded reasonable, not empty promises, at least not on the surface. I watched the room as Caleb spoke. Some people leaned forward, a few took notes. There was a sense of relief spreading quietly, as if someone had finally offered a clear path through a fog of pressure. But the longer I listened, the more I felt uneasy. Not because of what Caleb said, but because of what he did not say. Throughout the entire presentation, there was no space for risk control, no mention of accountability when systems failed, no acknowledgement of the unglamorous elements that kept products stable when things did not go as planned. In that moment, it became clear my team had not been removed because we were wrong. We were removed because we no longer fit the new story the company wanted to tell. We were the part that slowed things down, the part that always asks what happens when things go wrong. Caleb finished to measured applause. Richard returned to the stage and emphasized that this was the future the company needed to pursue. He said recent changes were necessary to make room for this new model to grow. No one said it directly, but the message was unmistakable. What disappeared from the 12th floor was the cost of that future. I raised my hand. Richard saw me. There was a brief hesitation before he nodded. I did not ask about grand strategy or long-term vision. I asked a question I had asked hundreds of times in my career, a practical one. If this system fails at 3 o'clock in the morning while enterprise customers are operating, who holds the final responsibility for restoring stability? The room went quiet for a few seconds. No one looked offended. No one rushed to respond. Caleb glanced at Richard. Richard looked back at Caleb. Then Caleb smiled and spoke about self-correcting systems, about artificial intelligence detecting and responding faster than humans. It was a good answer if my question had been what the system would do. But that was not my question. No one mentioned people. No one mentioned final decisions. No one mentioned accountability. When things did not go as expected, I nodded and sat back down. There was no need to ask more. I had my answer. The meeting ended with just enough optimism. People stood and exchanged a few positive remarks. I left more slowly, waiting until the room was nearly empty before stepping into the hallway. On the way back to my desk, I passed the space where my team had once sat. The image locked itself to what I had just heard. The future they were describing had no room for people who asked about consequences. I do not oppose the future. I never have. I spent my entire career helping this company adapt to change. But as I sat down and opened my computer, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. I simply do not believe in a future without breaks. Software rarely collapses all at once. It gives you time to believe everything is still fine. After that meeting, things began to move very quickly. Not loudly. No big announcements. Just small changes in meeting schedules, in internal documents, in the way people talked about the process. The kind of changes that look like normal adjustments if you are not paying close attention. I noticed early testing procedures that had existed for years were shortened, not eliminated outright, just renamed with something that sounded more reasonable. Optimization, simplification, removing unnecessary steps. Documents that once required a formal sign-off now only need to be marked complete. Cross-team reviews became optional. No one said testing no longer mattered. They only said it could not slow things down. I sat in those meetings and listened. I did not object immediately. I asked very specific questions. Questions about what would happen if part of the system failed to respond on time. About how errors would be detected when input data did not match expectations. Those questions were usually acknowledged then drifted away with promises to revisit them later. Later is a very convenient word. Deployments for large customers were accelerated ahead of schedule. Familiar names appeared on the rollout list. Companies that had trusted us for years. Organizations that depended on this system to run their most critical operations. In the past, every deployment like that came with multiple layers of validation and monitoring. This time was different. Everything moved so fast that even the people directly involved felt like they were chasing the plan rather than leading it. The first issues were small. A report is loading a few seconds slower. A status message is failing to update on time. Nothing serious, at least not the way it was framed. The issues were logged and labeled as learning. A very gentle, very positive term. We are learning, people said. I had heard that phrase many times in my career. I believe in learning from mistakes. But I have always drawn a clear line between learning and ignoring. When you learn, you stop to understand. When you ignore, you move faster and hope things fix themselves. Frontline staff began to feel the difference. Night shift operators sent messages asking whether new system behavior was expected. Customer support engineers started holding calls longer than usual. Not because they lacked answers, but because they were not sure whether what they were seeing was normal or a sign of something else. I heard them talking in hallways in the kitchen. In brief exchanges when they thought no one was listening. Not panic, just the very practical concern of people who would be responsible when something went wrong. One afternoon, I received a call from a client I had known for many years. He was in his 60s with a slow, steady voice. The kind of person who does not call unless it truly matters. He did not circle the issue. Your system is not as stable as it used to be. I asked what specifically worried him. He described delayed data moments when the system failed to respond during processes his company depended on minute by minute. He was not angry, just disappointed. I do not care whether you use artificial intelligence or anything else, he said. I just need it to work at 3 o'clock in the morning when no one is here to fix things manually. I thanked him for being direct. After the call ended, I sat still for a long time. Not because I was surprised, but because I knew calls like that are rarely isolated. From that point on, I began documenting things methodically. Not to prove anyone wrong, but to understand the chain of events forming beneath the surface. I recorded dates of decisions, who proposed them, who approved them, which warnings were raised and then set aside. I noted even small things like how a new term replaced an old risk. No one knew I was doing this. I did not tell anyone. This was not an act of resistance. It was professional instinct. When you have worked in operations long enough, you understand that every major failure begins with very small things. No one wants to stop and examine closely. On the surface, everything still looked fine. Dashboards stayed green. Weekly reports remained positive. The numbers leadership wanted to see kept moving in the right direction. There was no reason to panic if you only looked at appearances. But underneath, I could feel the tension building. Not the tension of an imminent crisis, but the strain of a system being pushed beyond its safe margin. Like a rope pulled tighter and tighter, not broken yet, but no longer elastic. I kept coming to work each day, attending meetings, answering emails, doing exactly what my role required. I did not raise alarms. I did not share my notes with anyone. Not yet. I watched and waited because experience had taught me one thing. When people start calling risk opportunity, when speed becomes the highest goal, the cost does not disappear. It is only delayed. And sooner or later, someone will be the one who pays it. Richard did not ask me to lie. He only wanted me to stay silent. After the first rollout phase, I realized that change did not come from one big decision, but from many small ones. Gaps began appearing in my calendar. Strategy meetings that once included me no longer had my name on the invite list. Summary emails arrived only after decisions were already made. No one announced it. No one explained it. Everything happened softly enough that if someone asked, it could be brushed off as a coincidence. I still came to the office every day. I still did my job. But my sphere of influence was clearly shrinking. Not through orders, but through a new organizational habit. A habit in which I was no longer at the center. One afternoon, I received a private meeting invite from Richard's assistant. No title, no agenda, just an open slot on his calendar. I was not surprised. I had been expecting this meeting from the moment I realized I was being eased out of the decision circle. Richard's office sat at the corner of the building with glass walls overlooking the city. When I walked in, he stood up to shake my hand, his smile polite and measured. On his desk, a stack of papers lay neatly clipped together as if it had been waiting for me. He began in a gentle tone. He said he valued my experience, that he understood I had spent many years building processes that kept the system stable. Those recent changes might have made me uncomfortable. Every sentence was carefully weighed, nothing excessive, nothing confrontational. Then he moved straight to the point. For the new model to work efficiently, the company needed complete alignment, he said. One clear voice. Fewer perspectives could create noise during the transition. As he said this, he slid the stack of papers toward me. It was a responsibility transfer document. Not long, not vague. The meaning was clear. I would no longer be the final authority for system operations. My role would be adjusted, focused on advisory support. Richard emphasized that this was not a demotion, just a restructuring aligned with the new direction. I picked up the papers and read slowly. On the page, every word made sense, but I could also see what was not written. When something failed, when the system did not respond on time, my name would no longer sit at the end of the chain. Responsibility would be distributed, blurred, and harder to trace. Richard watched me, waiting. He did not rush me. He did not threaten me. This was not a confrontation. It was an offer presented as good governance. In the days that followed, even before I gave him an answer, I felt the shift spreading. Fewer colleagues came to me for input. When I offered feedback in brief discussions, some listened, others quickly moved on. Somewhere I heard a phrase being used about me, light enough to avoid argument, resistant to change. No one said it directly to my face, but I had been here long enough to recognize when a label starts attaching itself to your name. I took time to think, not about titles, but about consequences. I asked myself whether I was being too rigid, whether I was clinging to old processes simply because they were familiar. I did not want to become someone who blocked progress out of fear. But every time I reopened my notes, the warnings that had been dismissed, the customer calls, the same pattern appeared. This was not a difference in vision. It was a difference in how risk and responsibility were treated. A few days later, I returned to Richard's office. The papers were still on his desk. This time, a pen was placed neatly on top. Its tip pointed toward me. A small detail, but clear enough. Richard said he hoped I understood the situation, that signing would help the company move forward without friction, that I could still contribute as long as I did not introduce voices that slowed momentum. I looked at the pen for a few seconds, not because I hesitated over the signature, but because I thought about the times in the past when I had chosen silence to keep things running smoothly. This time was different. This time, silence would leave a dangerous gap. I slid the papers and the pen back toward Richard slowly, deliberately. I said I could not sign. Richard tilted his head slightly as if unsure he had heard correctly. He asked whether I understood what that meant. I nodded. I understood that refusing now would make things harder. I understood it could reinforce the image others were already assigning to me. But I also understood something else. If I signed, when the system failed, when customers were affected, no one would be in a position clear enough to be accountable, and the cost then would be far greater. I told Richard the first was not refusing out of anger, not out of personal disagreement. I was refusing because I knew exactly where the consequences would lead. Richard said nothing more. He only nodded, his expression closing. The meeting ended quickly. As I left that office, I knew I had crossed a line. Not a line of power, but a line of silence. I did not refuse out of anger. I refused because I knew where the consequences would lead. I could not keep my job, but I could keep them from being erased. After leaving Richard's office, I did not go straight back to my desk. I walked around the building once slowly, as if I needed time to put everything back into the right place in my head. I knew that from that moment on, my position in the organization had changed, permanently. But what weighed on me most was not my title. It was the people who had once sat on the 12th floor, the ones who had been wiped from the system in a matter of days. I began meeting them one by one. Not informal meetings, no calendar invites, no glass conference rooms, just very ordinary encounters, coffee in the morning, a short lunch, a phone call that ran longer than expected at the end of the day. I did not promise anything big. I listened first. They told me what had happened after they were removed from the project. The sense of disorientation. The confusion of not understanding how years of contribution could suddenly stop being mentioned. Some were angry. Some were disappointed. Some were simply quiet as if they had not yet found words for what they were feeling. I told them one thing very clearly. I could not keep my job here. I no longer had that authority. But I could make sure that when they walked away, they would not carry an invisible question mark over their competence or their professional integrity. I started with very concrete actions. I called people I had worked with for years, former partners, managers who had seen my team handle situations no one else wanted. I did not embellish anything. I told the truth that the product reliability team had kept the system standing during the hardest moments, that they were not victims of incompetence but the result of a strategic decision. I helped them update their professional profiles, not to make them shinier but to make them more accurate. I read every line, every responsibility, every result. I removed vague language and replaced it with outcomes that could be verified. I reminded them that professional reputation is not about being kept or let go, but about what you did when the system was still running. For some, I introduced them to companies that needed exactly that kind of experience. Not flashy places, but organizations that understood the value of stability. For others, I served as a reference. I told recruiters plainly that they were speaking with people I was willing to put my own credibility behind. In those conversations, I realized something. What hurt them most was not losing a job. It was the feeling of being erased from the story as if everything they had done had never existed. That was the part I could not accept. When I was younger, I worked in environments where crisis was normal. Systems operating under constant constraint where a small mistake could lead to serious consequences. I learned then that in crisis people do not need grand promises. They need clarity. They need to know that someone sees them and will not look away when things become uncomfortable. That experience stayed with me throughout my career. I know how to read small signals before a system fails. I also know that when you protect people at the right moment, they do not forget it. Not in a way that creates obligation, but in a way that builds trust. I did not tell my former team what was happening inside leadership. I did not pull them into political tension they did not need to carry. I focused on one thing, making sure that when they moved into the next chapter of their careers, they did not have to carry a stain that did not belong to them. Gradually, the calls began coming back the other way. One person said they had a strong interview. Another said the recruiter asked in detail about their time working with me. I answered every call, every email in the same tone, calm, precise, no exaggeration. At the same time, I continued working at the company. I did not make public what I was doing. I did not turn protecting my former team into a moral statement. I simply did what I believed was right. One evening, as I reviewed my old notes, I realized something I had not named before. The people I was helping were leveraging the system, but could not see it. Not because they would come back seeking revenge, but when they were placed in the right roles, in the right organizations, what they knew and what they had lived through would create comparisons no presentation could hide. I did not need to push that outcome. I only needed to make sure they walked away with the truth in their hands. When you protect people the right way, they do not disappear. They spread. They carry their story into other places. And sooner or later, the system that believed it could erase them is forced to confront the value it ignored. When you protect people the right way, they become valuable. The system cannot erase them. The dashboard that day was green enough to reassure everyone. Too reassuring. The presentation had been prepared down to the smallest detail. I knew that the moment I received the invite. The meeting room was on the top floor, usually reserved for investors and the advisory board. Time was allocated down to the minute. Slides had been pre-checked for color, font, and contrast. There was no room for mistakes, at least on the screen. I chose a seat in the back row. No one asked, no one noticed. From there, I could see both the stage and the reactions of the people in front. Familiar investors, a few new faces. All of them are ready to be reassured. Caleb walked onto the stage with his usual confidence. He barely looked at his notes. The slides behind him were clean, modern, perfectly aligned with what the market liked to see. Growth charts curved upward. Stability metrics were shaded in deep green, response time, success rate, system efficiency. Everything looked good. Caleb talked about scalability, about how the new system could handle more load with fewer resources. He emphasized that stability had improved significantly compared to earlier phases. The numbers were neat, easy to digest, just enough to make people nod. I looked at the dashboard on the screen. It really was green. No alerts, no anomalies. If you only looked at that, you would believe the system was running almost perfectly. But I knew what that dashboard was measuring. It measured what had been chosen to be measured. In the weeks leading up to this, I had seen how metrics were adjusted, not by making the system better, but by changing how things were recorded. A minor error was removed from tracking because it was classified as expected behavior. A delay softened by averaging over a longer time window. No one lied. They simply told the story using a more comfortable set of rulers. While Caleb was talking about the system's self-adjustment capabilities, my phone vibrated lightly in my jacket pocket. I did not need to look to know who it was. The night operations support team. I opened the message quickly under the table. A customer was experiencing a data synchronization issue. Not a major outage, but enough to slow a critical process. They had called the hotline twice, but no one had picked up because the new shift allocation system was still in trial. I looked back up. On the screen, the response time chart was still green. An investor in the front row raised a hand and asked how the system handled edge cases when data did not follow predicted models. Caleb smiled. He answered confidently. He said those situations had been accounted for, that the system learned continuously and improved over time, that the current metrics were the clearest proof. It sounded like a solid answer if you were not the one receiving messages at midnight. Another question went deeper, asking about issues that did not bring the system down entirely, but still affected customer operations. Caleb paused for a very brief moment, then advanced to the next slide. He explained that the company had refined its definition of incidents to better reflect the overall experience. Not every deviation needed to be treated as a failure. Focusing too much on small details could slow innovation, he said. I heard a few nods of agreement. I also listened to a very soft sigh behind me. Someone from my former technical team sat nearby, head lowered, saying nothing. My phone vibrated again. The customer had activated a fallback process on their own, but they were unhappy. They wanted a callback. I locked the screen. Not because I did not care, but because I knew this picture needed to be seen in full. The presentation ended with polite applause. Richard stepped up, thanked Caleb and emphasized that the company was moving in the right direction. These green numbers proved the restructuring decision was necessary. I looked around. Many people seemed relieved. Green has a powerful calming effect. After the meeting, people stood and exchanged quick remarks. I heard familiar phrases. Very impressive. The right direction. Finally catching up with the market. No one mentioned what had not appeared on the slides. Caleb stood among a group of investors answering questions with ease. And when questions drifted toward real operations, he skillfully redirected to the bigger picture. Not blunt avoidance, just a shift in focus. I left the room a little early. In the hallway, I stopped, opened my phone, and called the customer who had messaged. I apologized for the delay. I listened as they described the issue. I did not dismiss their experience and I did not blame the new system. I wrote down every detail the way I always had. After the call ended, I stood still for a moment. I thought about the green charts I had just seen. About the reassurance they provided. About how a well-LD story could convince people that everything was fine, even as small cracks were beginning to form underneath. Green does not answer the phone at midnight. It does not speak to worried customers. It does not take responsibility when a process breaks at the most sensitive moment. On the way back to my desk, I opened my notes again. The timelines, the changes in measurement, the questions are answered with slides instead of action. I did not need to make noise. I did not need to prove anyone wrong right now. Truth does not need to be loud. It only needs the right moment. They did not call me for my opinion. They called because something no longer lined up. The call came on an entirely ordinary morning. Not urgent, not rushed. The board's assistant said they wanted me to join a short working session over the weekend. Not a full board meeting. Just a focused discussion to clarify some data related to the recent transition. I listened and said I would be there. I knew exactly why they were calling. When good-looking numbers are repeated often enough, sooner or later, people start noticing the gaps between them. Not everyone sees it right away, but the board is different. Their job is not to believe. It is to compare. The session took place in a small conference room. No large screens, no slides prepared in advance, just a long table, a few printed documents, and familiar faces who had followed this company for years. I was not asked to prepare a presentation. I did not bring slides. I brought my notes. The board chair opened with a very direct statement. He said they wanted to better understand the discrepancy between the metrics recently presented and the feedback they were receiving from several long-term customers. He did not say who was right or wrong. He only said that something no longer fit the way it used to. I nodded. I said I understood the question. I started with the basics, not a strategy, not vision. I laid out the timeline. When testing processes were shortened, when stability measurements were adjusted, when certain types of incidents were reclassified. Each point came with dates, decisions, and the officially recorded rationale. I did not say those decisions were wrong. I only showed how they changed the way we saw the system. I gave concrete examples. A response time metric that improved because the averaging window was extended. An error rate that dropped because a class of issues had been moved into a different category. The numbers were not false. They just did not tell the whole story. The room was very quiet. No one interrupted me. I knew I was addressing exactly what they needed to hear. Not accusations, but the connection between data and operational reality. One board member asked whether I believed the current team was intentionally hiding problems. I answered immediately that I did not. I said most of the people involved genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. The pressure to show progress was real, and when that pressure becomes strong enough, people choose metrics that make it easier to breathe. I said the issue was not individual motivation. It was the decision structure. I explained how operational accountability had been dispersed. When there is no longer a single point of final responsibility, small decisions become easier, but consequences become harder to trace. I said the current system did not encourage stopping to ask difficult questions because no one was explicitly tasked with answering them. Another member asked what I would do differently if given the choice. I did not answer right away. I paused briefly, not for effect, but to make sure I said what mattered, not what sounded pleasant. I said I would not return to the old structure. I was not proposing a full reversal of the changes. I said the company needed a new operating structure where speed and accountability did not cancel each other out. I proposed clearly separating the two streams. One focused on innovation and rapid experimentation with clearly defined risk boundaries. One responsible for protecting the core system with the authority to halt deployments when signals cross safety thresholds. The two streams would not compete, they would complement each other. And most importantly, each stream would have a single person with final accountability, empowered to act and required to answer when things went wrong. I did not mention any names. I did not talk about the meetings I had been excluded from. I did not bring up the transfer document I had refused to sign, not because I was afraid, but because none of that helped the board make a better decision. One board member asked whether I would be willing to return to my previous role if the structure were adjusted. The question was posed lightly, but I knew it mattered. I said I was not there to reclaim an old position. I said that if the goal was simply to swap who sat in the chair, the same problem would repeat in a different form. I was there because I did not want this company to learn that lesson by harming more customers and more people. No one argued. No one nodded right away. That is how boards work. They do not respond with emotion. They respond with time and the next question. The session ended without a formal conclusion. I left the room with a very familiar feeling. Not victory, not defeat, just the sense that what needed to be placed on the table had been placed in the right way. When I walked out, I did not know what the board would decide, but I knew one thing clearly. From that moment on, the story was no longer just about green slides or polished demos. It had become a story about structure, accountability, and how an organization treats truth when it stops being convenient. I did not come to reclaim an old role. I came to make sure this mistake does not repeat. Richard called it a misunderstanding. The data called it consequences. The next board meeting took place without me in the room. That did not surprise me. At that stage, my presence was no longer necessary. I had already laid out the data trail, the timelines, and the decision structure. What remained was no longer debate, but comparison. But Richard could not wait. He called me that evening, not with anger, but with the familiar tone of someone trying to maintain control. He said the board was misunderstanding the situation, that the numbers were being pulled out of context. A few early hiccups could not judge a transformation strategy. He used the word misunderstanding several times, as if naming it that way could make it lighter. I listened until he finished. I did not argue. I said only one thing. The board was comparing independent data, and data does not care about intent. The call ended quickly. No long goodbye. The next day, Caleb appeared before the board with a very different posture from the investor demo. Less confident, more careful. He brought new slides, but this time he did not talk much about the future. He talked about the past, the companies he had worked for. The projects were once considered successful. Familiar numbers repeated as proof of proven capability. He emphasized that his model had worked before. What was happening now was simply an adjustment phase. The board listened, but they were not carried away. By then, they had already commissioned an independent analysis team to review the entire operational dataset. Not Caleb's team. Not any team reporting to Richard. A group reporting directly to the board with a clear mandate. Place the metrics next to raw data and real customer feedback. The process happened quietly. No internal announcement, no long emails, but the outcome required little interpretation. The timelines I had described were confirmed. Testing had been shortened before stability metrics began to improve. Incident reclassification occurred alongside the drop in error rates on the dashboard. Delays that disappeared in long-term averages reappeared clearly when examined in transaction-level logs. There was no explosive moment, no slam tables, no raised voices, just a sequence of cold conclusions. The board saw that metrics had improved under new definitions while customer experience had not kept pace. That deployment speed increased, but manual intervention increased as well. That was when responsibility was dispersed. No one had the authority to stop when stopping was necessary. Richard was asked to explain. He said innovation could not happen while keeping everything the same, that without accepting risk, the company would fall behind. Those arguments were not wrong in theory, but the board was not asking about theory. They asked about accountability. Who was responsible when that risk became concrete harm to customers? Caleb was asked the same question. He said his system was designed to self-learn. The current issues would diminish over time. When the board compared similar cases from his previous companies, he spoke about different contexts, market pressure, and actors beyond control. No one argued. The board simply recorded. The decisions that followed did not look like punishment. They looked like governance. A new operations committee was created, reporting directly to the board. Testing processes that had been cut were restored with explicit veto authority when metrics crossed risk thresholds. Dashboards were required to present multiple measurement views side by side so there would no longer be a single story. And most importantly, responsibility was reattached to specific roles. Richard was not removed immediately, but direct control over operations was no longer his. Not because of malice, but because the structure he built allowed risk to drift without ownership. Caleb was not dismissed on the spot either. His role was narrowed to controlled experimentation only. No influence over the core system. No large slides, no grand showcases. No one used the word failure. But no one used the word breakthrough anymore. I was not present when those decisions were announced. I received only a short email from the board assistant. "Thank you for the analysis. We will reach out if further discussion is needed." I read the email and set my phone down. I did not feel satisfied. I did not feel sad. Just a familiar sensation when a system is finally forced to confront the assumptions it relied on. A few days later, I ran into Richard in the hallway. He looked more tired, less certain. He said things had gone too far, that if I had spoken earlier, it might have been different. I did not argue. I said only that I had spoken in the way I believed was responsible. He did not respond. Caleb avoided me. I did not seek him out. We had stood on opposite sides of the same issue for a long time. This collapse did not need drama. It unfolded the way systems usually collapse, one layer at a time when assumptions are no longer protected by data. Innovation does not exempt accountability. It only brings accountability sooner. I am not happy when someone loses their job, but I am not sorry for the truth. The official decision arrived on a quiet afternoon. No company-wide announcement, no large meeting, just a short email from the board with language chosen carefully. Richard was no longer in an executive role. His responsibilities were reassigned temporarily while the company moved into a full operational restructuring. I read the email once, then closed my laptop. I did not feel relieved. I did not feel victorious. It was simply the feeling you get when something inevitable finally happens. A few weeks later, Caleb left the company. Not with noise, but with a quiet update in the internal system. He moved on to another project somewhere else. I did not follow it. His story was no longer connected to my work. What mattered more was what came after. The board asked me to return not to my old position but to a new role, one focused entirely on operations and decision structure. No overlapping reports, no gray areas of responsibility. Everything was redesigned so that when something went wrong, there would be no guessing about who owned it. I accepted, not to prove anything, but because I believed this system was still worth fixing. The first days were quiet, no big meetings, no vision statements. I started by sitting down with small groups, listening, asking basic questions. What makes you hesitate to stop a deployment when you see risk? What makes you choose silence instead of asking a hard question? I did not blame anyone. I simply recorded what I heard. We rebuilt the testing process, not to slow things down, but to know exactly when to stop. We redefined metrics not to make them look worse, but to make them honest. Every dashboard came with a clearly named owner, not an abstract department. Most importantly, we put operations back where they belonged, not as an obstacle to innovation, but as the safety brake that keeps innovation from turning reckless. During that time, I stayed in touch with my former team. The ones who had left, the ones who had started new jobs elsewhere. I did not pull them back. I did not need to. What surprised me was that their value did not disappear. Their new companies began talking about how they worked, about their caution, about their ability to see problems before they escalated. Those stories came back to me not as praise, but as quiet. They were not erased from the system. They were simply placed into systems that knew how to value them. Occasionally, I receive from people I have never met. They say they heard the story and saw themselves in it, that they were once labeled slow, resistant, or not aligned with a future someone else had drawn. I do not reply to all of them, but I read every message. If you are listening and have ever felt undervalued, I want to tell you one thing. The problem is not always you. Sometimes you are standing inside a system that does not know how to measure value correctly. You do not need to shout to be noticed. You do not need to chase every new slogan. You only need to do your work well, clearly, and honestly, so that when the truth needs to speak, it has solid ground to stand on. If this story feels familiar, if you have ever worked in an invisible basement of your career, let me know. Leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from. It does not matter whether you are in the United States or anywhere else in the world. Systems like this exist everywhere. And if you want to hear more stories about work, professional ethics, and how people and systems collide, you can subscribe to this channel, not to watch who wins or loses, but to learn together how to build systems that are better, fairer, and more sustainable. You do not need to speak loudly to be heard. You only need to be prepared enough for the truth to speak for itself.